Hi, my name is Madeline Pierpont. I manage partnerships and development for Lumen Art Projects, parent company to the Lumen Prize for Art and Technology. We exist to not only celebrate artists working with technology, but also to create opportunities for artists working with technology across the globe. I'd like to thank CADIF for inviting Lumen to host 3 events featuring artworks and artists from the Lumen community. I'm excited to be moderating one such event, a panel discussion on mapping and spatial dynamics with 3 Lumen artists, Max Colson, Liliana Farber, and Thompson, each of whom was shortlisted for or won Lumen Awards. Without further delay, I'm excited to invite you to listen in on a fascinating conversation. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our CADIF mapping chat. I'm Madeline Pierpont, Manager of Partnerships and Development for Lumen Art Projects, and I am incredibly pleased to be chatting with 3 Lumen artists today, Liliana Farber, Max Colson, and Thompson. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
So glad to have you.
Lovely to be here.
So to start off with, I was wondering if each of you could just describe a little bit about your practices and what interests you generally in the digital art market. We can start with you, Max.
Hi, my name is Max Colson. I'm really interested in architecture and landscape, and kind of using digital media, mainly film and image, to kind of look at specific landscapes and architectures and kind of deconstruct some of the stories or like the way that they're constructed, that's what I'm particularly interested in, and I have a kind of Great Britain specific focus.
Very cool. Liliana or Nye?
I'm Liliana Farber. I'm an artist originally from Uruguay, based in New York, and my practice kind of works at the intersection of art and technology. I'm very interested in kind of the history and the design ramifications of the protocols and the infrastructures that kind of define how we perceive reality, especially time and space. So my work, I investigate a lot in geographies and how are they mapped, and also protocols that define how we understand time.
Hi, I'm Thompson, and I'm an artist turned software designer turned artist again. I actually spend quite a lot of time trying to reframe for myself exactly what my practice is, but I would say that it's kind of broadly based around these sort of experimental software architectures that I create, and I use these to explore kind of things that really interest me. This network embedded power dynamics I'm very interested in, and also sort of the machine gaze and machine visions of the world. And then the outcome of these experiments can take various forms, sort of installation, or recently I've been doing a lot of moving image work, and actually I'm currently working on a sound piece.
Lovely. So each of your works, your recent works, and then also generally your practices, seems to be interested in spatial dynamics and mapping in some way or another, each one of you sort of taking a different angle on that. What is particularly interesting to each of you about the space is such a broad term, but about mapping and spatial dynamics and how we or one navigates them?
So for me, what is interesting, the way a map is made is how people understand space, and sort of maps create the space that they mapped. And in that sense, I am interested in how large corporations kind of like decide a way, unified way in a homogenic way to understand and to create space through digital means.
I'd just like kind of build on that and say that maps have always, and space has always been linked to power, and who, like, kind of space is constructed by finance, or people who have money in general, and not always, obviously, but I've got a quite a broad range of different projects, but one particular that I finished recently, called London Knowledge, is dealing with, I guess, like the prospect of self-driving cars, and the way that they use 3D scanning to see the city. And I've been really interested in, there's an academic called Shoshana Zuboff, who has kind of written this really amazing book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, about big tech companies, and she kind of talks about incursions that big tech companies make into our lives, in our cities, and one of those, like, incursions is through scanning and making maps of all of the places that we live in, with not very much questioning about how that will change our lives, so I'm kind of really interested in how the maps that they produce kind of they kind of make them beyond regulation. No one knows anything about the technology when they're doing it, and then they kind of reshape labor, the way that we live our lives in cities. And so I'm kind of really, that's one of the things that I'm really interested in, although I wouldn't say I've kind of totally like explored it to its full depth.
It would be hard to do so. There's a lot to explore there. Nai, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, I'm also very interested in the relationship between mapping and power and ownership, and the way that, I mean, particularly as it's expressed through software platforms, and the way that the owning the appearance of something, owning the appearance of the world, is a kind of ownership of that world. Mm-hmm. So I've been working a lot in Google Earth, which is, it is precisely a kind of manifestation of that. I mean, their sort of mapping of the world and the claiming the visual appearance of the world is like a kind of digital colonization, so digital colonialism. And I've been kind of interested in using, in sort of playing with that kind of that notion of ownership. And when I made my piece Flash Artifact, I kind of used those sort of systems to actually claim for myself a vast area of Mars. I was kind of interested in what the relationship in a space, when you map these spaces, and often they're spaces we will never go to and never see. So in a way, the person who owns, or the organisation that owns the image of that space, there comes to be, in a space that you can only perceive through digital mediation, there kind of comes to be very little difference between ownership and the appearance of ownership. Mm-hmm. So I just find that kind of playing around in that space very, very interesting.
So I think what's also interesting about each work, Terum and Aspect 2, Liliana's Terum and Aspect 2, Max's London Knowledge, and Nai's Slash Artifact, is the idea of who is performing the acts, or who is the one who holds the power in these spaces, and who is, forced to sort of go along with how these spaces are being defined. So I wonder if each of you could speak to how you think identity factors into each work, or just in general, how you think identity, individual identity, and also collective identity factors into mapping and spatial dynamics. Liliana, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm very interested in the idea that Nai was talking about of digital colonialism, and in my work I try to sort of create a more visible, parallel through using content, created through colonial times, islands that were like sort of discovered through colonial voyages, and bring those to the language of Google Earth, and to frame them into the problematics of current ways of mapping the world, sort of in a way to expose that these desires of mapping, of owning, of rebranding, these are not new. And for me, what is interesting is how in a way it's easier for us to sort of see those trials in older images, in older ways of creating a space, but somehow digital mapping kind of got away with it with the use of satellite photography. And so so I am interested to bring back these problematics to the fore, and talking about identity and the problems of these interfaces. For me, what is really interesting is these little things that happened in the photographic representation, that it can be invisible. For example, the use of resolution, and how it is used throughout the globe. And coming, for example, for a place, for a very small place in Uruguay, the resolution of the photography of like our representation, the presentation of the country is far less rich that you would see in Europe or in the United States. And so these kind of things are interested in how we are represented through one company that decides what is important to see and what is not, and through one algorithm, they kind of like really own the representation of the whole.
I think that's so interesting, Liliana, and the fact that you touched on resolutions. I did a piece before Slash Artifact, which was, it's like an epic journey around the Great Britain's shores. So it's sort of circling over the water borders just off the coastline. And one of the things that really struck me so powerfully was exactly this issue of resolution. So so as I sort of travelled, even around the UK, different areas would be in. So up in Scotland, in the Scottish Isles, the resolution would just really drop off. But then you get down south and you get to London and the southeast, and everything is really, really recent, really dense. And then also there's this kind of there's this space where the resolution just drops off. So you've got your country, and then you've got like the border, a sea around it, and then there's just a sort of a space where the resolution just drops off completely, and it's almost replaced with like this sort of I guess this sort of very kind of crude sort of generated water. So it's like there's this border where the sort of attention stops, which I found really, really interesting. And also you've got this kind of thing where you get these borders where one type of data, these sort of data borders, where one sort of imagery and a certain resolution meets another. I did a piece, or I was looking for a while back around the US-Mexican border, and you'd kind of see that quite a lot, where you'd have the US side of the border, really high resolution. You just literally, you're looking at the border, and then to the south, suddenly the resolution just drops off spectacularly, and it kind of followed literally followed that border. That kind of act of intensity of looking is just, it's a really interesting a really interesting aspect of the way that the world is mapped.
They're also kind of, both of these points are like kind of moments where the supposed objectivity of the technology, you realize it's subjective and it has a focus, and there are areas that are of less interest to the mappers, whoever they are, and I think you can also see that in the kind of 3D scans like Lidar scanning, which they have they do have resolution, and you can see resolution, but it's spread over a radius. So at the center of the scan, you have very dense, you can see what's being focused on, but then at the periphery, you have of a scan, you can see the areas that are of less interest. And I think it's always difficult to hit yourself in the head and jolt yourself when you're looking at these maps, and remind yourself that these maps, they're made by people. They're not made by machines, or they're hybrid, but I think it's really, those moments are really important to point out and make work about.
I mean, it's because the other thing I was thinking about when you were talking about identity, it's not just the who, which is really interesting. I think the what is really interesting as well. I remember when I was, I'm sorry, my son, I should have told him.
You're fine.
When I was making Intel, I was doing all this satellite footage. I was thinking about Google's ownership, and then all of the mapping companies that Google works with, all the imaging companies, and I suddenly had this weird sort of revelatory moment when I realized I had kind of, all of this view is obviously it's satellite photography, but I had almost internalized the satellite viewpoint. I'd almost I'd forgotten that they existed in the middle of this process, and I had kind of internalized that way of looking at the world. And I just thought that was, it's sort of slightly, I don't know, it's sort of slightly off topic, but just sort of thinking about that whole almost invisible ecosystem of satellites and hardware up in low and mid and high Earth orbit, and it's like a wild west up there of kind of jostling for military, political, commercial power. And so there was that whole kind of layer in this view, in this vision that somehow is so kind of subtle that you kind of don't see it. But then that also kind of sort of opens up that whole thing about the kind of the angle of the viewpoint, maybe related to what you were saying, Matt. So what does it mean to look at something from a particular angle when you have that vertical view of the world, and it's like this kind of godlike, megalomaniac sort of view of the world where everything, socio-economics and politics and environmental things all just become aesthetics. And that's just it's just a really interesting space.
I think that's fascinating, and it speaks to, I think, this question of perspective and perception, because the way, even across different cultures in the world, the way that space is perceived and the way that maps are perceived and just one's relation to the world around oneself is different. And I think when you bring technology into it, that becomes even more complicated. So, I mean, you all use tech in what you create, but I also think that perhaps, if I'm not overstating or misstating, there's also a commentary on tech, even though you're using it in your creation of the work. So I wanted to ask about how tech informs your own perspective on your work, and also how you think tech informs perspectives on space and mapping in general, and then into the future as, you know, as technology only becomes more and more a part of our daily lives.
One thing that I find interesting when we're talking about perspective and point of view is that to have a broad perspective, for example, from a tower, you know, as cities or imperias were protecting themselves and they want to see, you know, to have a broad view. It was a use of technology and a relationship, you know, with technology and power to have the ability to have a vertical view from the land. That is something that common people didn't have access to. And so I do find really interesting how it does still, you know, building on what Nai was saying about the layers of the satellites, and it is also embodiment of power through technology that it's obviously is different and developed, but in a way it maintains the same, you know, relationship and the relationship of access, right? We tend to believe that we have access now to the product, but it's a mediated access, it's a design access, and it's not really, we don't have really access to put our seeing devices in managing what are their path and what time of the day or the year, what are they really seeing. It is a mediation as so many others, that is through the mediation. It is a narrative in decisions, you know, in a power structure.
I would just say, in terms of kind of commentary on technology, I mean, I kind of, I'm really, well, I guess kind of big data, it's amazing in that it means that we can, or people or corporations can quantify huge amounts of information and make sense of the world through information. But I'm interested in well, there's this kind of quote that Jaron Lanier, he kind of said, information, like systems need information in order to run, but information underrepresents reality. And there's a kind of continual drive to map and classify everything in order to understand it and make the world better. But you know, there's and you can obviously achieve a huge amount. You can understand a huge, you know, life to a huge, you know, to like a kind of degree of granularity and detail that you couldn't do before. But you also end up with maps of things which kind of reduce everything to objects and collections and sets of similar looking objects. And you know, in this, you know, in one of the films I've made, London Knowledge, I'm kind of looking, it kind of presents a series of journeys through London streets which have been 3D scanned, But the people who are narrating these drives through 3D scan space are Londoners, or they're kind of traditionally working class taxi drivers who are probably going to be out of work in the next few decades because of this this technology. And I was kind of interested in just pairing this kind of local specificity, like this local knowledge, like these kind of the knowledge that's built up over time by these people, by their profession, with this kind of indiscriminate kind of gaze, or like that's kind of is the way that the built environment will be rendered, and so there's this kind of I guess one kind of commentary I'm interested in is how kind of quantification it classifies, but it also reduces complexity and uniqueness. And it's that tension that's really interesting. That's one of the things that's really interesting to me.
That's a great phrase. Did you say information underrepresents reality? Very nice.
Yeah, we need to quantify things, but we can't help but mess things up when we do stuff.
And then there's also like a kind of fixing of meanings, isn't there? Because our minds are much more fluid and are change in a way that a neural network doesn't. I mean, for me, as you say, Madeline, the technology that I use is as much the subject of works like Flash Artifact or Interlight as geography or as anything else. And I've just been interested for a long time in the way these big, powerful software platforms they shape our actions and they shape our viewpoints through their affordances, either deliberate or even accidental. And so, about how, they make certain behaviours easy, certain things hard, some things to be seen, some things are hard to see, and the way that things are defined and categorised. And as Matt said, the way these sort of meanings are actually lessened by being categorised and kind of grouped and quantified. I guess that tension between that mediated view of the world and the unmediated view of the world is just, that it's kind of, I suppose that's kind of where I'm sort of playing. There's something about these kind of images of the world that purport to represent truth and kind of reality, but of course they don't. They're technologically manipulated, they can be human manipulated. It just makes such a kind of fascinating space to explore.
Following that, how do you think aesthetics generally ties into politics of space? I mean, are aesthetics informing the way that we go about space, the way that big tech companies navigate space or define space for us, or is it sort of the other way around? There's these larger powers that are impacting our interpretation and representation of aesthetics. I don't know if that question was really roundabout, so let me know if you'd like me to repeat it. But I'm interested in understanding, the cultural productions that we have as societies across the globe and how that ties into politics and power.
That's a really interesting question. Oh, sorry, Liliana.
No, do you wanna go?
That was just really quick thought that there is certainly within this technology a I think, a kind of a move to reduce politics to aesthetics. I mean, something that I saw a lot, again, in sort of working in Google Earth, is how the amount of behind the scenes, I guess, sort of processing to make everything just look better. I come from Wales, where it's, the weather is generally kind of quite cold and wet and windy, but if you go on to Google Earth, the kind of seas around there are bright blue. But I think there's a kind of, as a political meta object, as something like Google Earth or satellite mapping is, there is clearly a layer of aesthetics placed on top of it, which I guess acts as a kind of sweetener for us to make it more digestible.
Liliana, you were going to say something?
No, that's interesting. I'm always fascinated about, through Google Earth, it seems like we live in a world without clouds, without rainy days. Everything is sunny, and that it's interesting. What I want to say, and it kind of like what Max was talking before, is about the representation of that information abstract. It's and it leaves behind all sort of sensitivities and different ways, to different types of knowledge. I'm like researching different older maps, and it's fascinating to see how space, it's not represented only by, you have like a paths of communication, where it will be roads, and you have buildings. This is how we used to see the world represented. But sometimes they are mapped according to what was important to a village, civilization. So you have here you have horses, and here you have like a big church, and how sometimes the routes are arranged according to more effective elements of what is important to a community, and not particularly this understanding of just buildings and the space in between. That it's how Google is represented, and we are used to see it that way. But it is interesting to think what happened with if we would approach a global map through an app that would show different effective ways of how the people interact with their space.
I guess like a kind of a different way of looking at the question of like kind of the relationship between politics and aesthetics in space, or like the built environment. Like another thing to think about, and something that I'm really interested in, I don't just use kind of mapping tools, but I'm very interested in architectural visualization and animation, and the kind of 3D photorealistic 3D rendering of space, and the role that has in producing space, like producing more space that looks like the spaces that have been 3D rendered in architectural visualization software, where the designs and things that are being rendered, like the flats, the homes, the tower blocks, they're produced from assets, 3D assets in like vast 3D libraries, and there's a kind of, it's like this kind of tension between kind of these like large libraries of kind of assets and things that we've classified, and now they're being, but there's always going to be a kind of limit, that those libraries are always going to be limited in some way. I think that kind of the archiving or 3D archiving of the built environment and is always going to produce repetition and similarity rather than like kind of organic new forms. And I think that has an effect on the kind of homes and spaces that are built. Those kind of relationships between the real world, the 3D rendered world, and the built world. And I think I'm kind of really interested in that.
It's also really interesting to think about, following on from what Max was saying about architects, landscapes actually designing things to be seen predominantly from above. Designing things specifically for the satellite gaze, or for how they will look on in satellite imagery on Google Earth. These islands in Dubai, or I believe the Olympic Park in London was built specifically to look really great from above, and that kind of almost prioritization of this sort of international, or this sort of the view which is not about a direct lived experience, but is about a kind of mediated remote experience.
That's really interesting. So it looks like we're at 9:40, so I think maybe we have time for one more question. Speaking to what you were just chatting about, the idea of digital space and then physical space is also, I think, of interest, especially because we live in a bordered world in some way or another. I mean, there are ways in which our communities, each person's communities are defined, but being able to communicate across the globe super quickly in the digital space complicates that notion, I think, sometimes of strict borders that exist around our lives. And I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on the physical space versus, Max, you were speaking about this a little bit, but the digital space versus the physical space, and how we interact in both of those spaces. How we interact in the digital space versus the physical space will change into the future, and also how it impacts our communities and our lived experience on a daily basis.
I think, I guess my response to that is kind of the I think kind of connects to what I was saying before about technology reducing complexity and kind of reducing the world to metrics and data points, which both allow, different places to be, or different locations to be mapped and understood in relation to each other. But at the same time, there's this kind of tension between like kind of mapping all of these different parts of the world, but then the visualizations also make it all kind of maybe like reducing uniqueness and reducing like an aura that, I don't know, a specific location or object has, and I think that kind of it. You know, when you look at the world digitally, it does feel borderless, and that's, I don't know, I think that's it's in one way you could say, well, that maybe is quite a nice feeling, but on the other hand, like it's also kind of different locations and communities have specific knowledges and customs and heritage, and that's something that's not worth, or has not been deemed to be worth mapping yet by these kind of different technologies. And I'm sure if big tech could make money out of it, they would. But that's my, I don't know. We kind of feel like we're living in a borderless world, but that's maybe just to do with the technology that we use.
I find really uncanny the fact that you can go to a city to visit. For example, you've never been in, and take the Google Maps app on the phone and like search. You want to go to this place, and it shows you the path, and it's so uncanny how the map is exactly the same that I can use in my city. And there is this feeling between the familiar, the known, and in the device, and what you see it around. And so this, building up on the fact that the aesthetics are the same, and this in a way you know how to navigate this digital space, and when you are in front of a completely different place. Sometimes even Google tells what are the most in Google Maps, what are the most transited streets, like you understand, like this is a place of interest, but this is you can really miss like the magic of a new place by following and just what Google understand that these places are more trafficked,
Nai, do you have any thoughts?
Actually that's really interesting, Liliana. That kind of in a way it's hard to get lost in a place, isn't it? That's almost gone. I don't know, when you were talking, I was just thinking about the kind of the relationship between borders, national sovereignty, digitally, and the kind of physical, digital conflict, because it feels it's kind of it's like I don't know, it's a bit of an arms race in a way, in terms of there are many technologies designed to disrupt ideas of borders and sovereign space, aren't they? Things like blockchain, cryptocurrencies, and the whole kind of those sort of very strong libertarian drivers that come out of the sort of the I don't know what's called the technological hegemony, where the sort of and there's but at the same time then you see countries trying to tighten up using digital tools, the kind of control of their sovereignty and what their citizens can think and see and can't think and can't see. And then, of course, on these sort of other end of the scale, privacy campaigners and human rights campaigners, again, trying to disrupt and undermine that sort of tightening of national borders by governments. So it kind of feels like there's a real sort of arms race between governmental tools to enforce sovereignty and borders, and tools used by individuals to disrupt and undermine. I have no idea who's going to come out on top of that.
I was really hoping that Australia would really stop Facebook,
it would have been so good.
and kind of actually regulate Facebook and kind of get Facebook to pay publishers in Australia. And I was interested in how that, hopefully that will create some kind of domino effect of different countries enforcing or regulating a kind of supranational company.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's very difficult for nation states to do that. And yeah,
actually, it's interesting to think when you're saying that about how something like Facebook it has its own borders and becomes kind of its own sovereign entity. So there are all these superimposed kind of software platform borders on sort of traditional country national borders.
Yeah, I think big tech has been running unchecked for a long time, but I feel as though we're hitting sort of a breaking point, but maybe I'm not sure. We'll see. We will see in the next few years or 10 years. But this has been an amazing conversation. To ask one last question of each of you, what are each of you working on right now? If you could give everyone a little sneak peek into what is coming out next. We could start with Max. Would you like to start?
Okay, I'm making a kind of a 3D interactive game called The Island, and it's basically an island where it's not quite clear whether you're in 1940s Second World War Britain or whether you're in Britain of today, and you have to work it out based on what you hear and see. But it's kind of looks and feels like a World War II shooter game.
So cool.
Oh yeah, and it will be kind of exhibited with vitrine, and it will open on the 19th of June.
Really specific, amazing.
Where is it opening, or is it opening digitally?
It's going to be opening online, so you'll be able to play it.
Oh wow, that's exciting. Nice. Nai, what are you working on currently?
I'm working on a choral piece for satellites.
A choral piece?
A choral piece, yes, for satellites.
I don't know what. Do you mind telling me what that is? I don't know what a choral piece is.
So it's a chorus, basically. It's a
chorus.
Choral, yeah.
Got it.
For satellites.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very interesting kind of how there's, I talked a little bit about satellites earlier, and there's this kind of really crazy power dynamic mismatch between us and that kind of incredibly powerful but almost hidden sort of ecosystem. So I'm interested in ways of finding new kind of power balances. So as a result, I'm going to make the satellites produce music for me.
Wow, great! And so, do you know when that is coming out? When that's launching?
There will be a first pass. I've got a solo show in Romania in October, so I'll be first showing it there, and then I'm hoping there's going to be something in London early next year. The full-on immersive experience.
Great. And Liliana, what are you working on?
Well, I have several pieces working on the studio, but one that relates to this topic. Well, doing a work around a series of islands that are tiny that are disputed by several countries, but according to international law, they shouldn't be categorized as islands, and they appear as information. They have, like, when you search them in Google Earth, you have the point, but there's no photographic representation. The location point, it's and this digital fake blue from the Google Earth ocean. So for me, they're kind of like the little, the little text on this agreement of what is how we understand geography, and at this point where it kind of breaks what we understand. Is this just a rock? Is this an island? Which country they belong to? And so it has all these questions that for me speak to how we broadly understand what is in synchronization, what is the limits of the world.
Wow. Well, I
Nice.
can't wait to see each of those works when they come out. Before I say a big thank you to all of you, I wondered if you have any last thoughts on our discussion today. Any closing comments?
I just want to say that it was really a pleasure for me to talk with you guys. Also to learn more about your practice. I found it fascinating.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, it was. It's not often I get to talk in detail about this kind of stuff, and yeah, no, it's just yeah, kind of yeah, it was really, really interesting. I really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Yeah, ditto from me. It's been really, really great to hook up with Max again and meet you, Liliana, and hear more about your work and ideas. And also, this was a really great topic. I haven't done a kind of discussion on mapping before. I think that was a really nice theme to pin a conversation around.
I agree, and on behalf of Lumen Art Projects and also on behalf of CADF, thank you to each of you for taking time to chat about this. But I think there's so much more. I mean, I feel like space and mapping really informs so much of what we do. I feel like we could have a 3-hour-long conversation about this. But thank you to each of you, and I hope you have a great, lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Madeleine.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.